So, Deltarune Chapter 4 is full of mysteries, some being related to the Roaring Knight's existence and others being related to the mystery man behind the tree. However, one mystery that I feel has yet to have a proper discussion is who this person on the other end of the phone is. It is a very peculiar piece of the game as there is a huge air of mystery covering this entire portion of Deltarune's plot, along with the major question of who the heck is this mystery person? Well, in order to answer that question, there are several things that we'll have to go over, including December Holiday and Asriel Dreamer, extremely hidden pieces of evidence in the code, and several other things. But before we begin, welcome to Epoch, your favorite place for everything indie game related, and let's figure out who exactly is calling Kris's phone. Now, in the scenes leading up to this event, we see Kris and Susie starting a hangout with Noelle at her house, one which normally ends up in Kris going and looking for clues by themselves, which after going to December's room will cause Kris to rip out the soul, tossing us inside a closet that is supposed to keep us trapped. However, by traversing through air vents inside Noelle's house, we can see several things that should have been mysteries to us, one such thing being this call which Kris has with some unknown person. The dialogue that we can read goes as follows. Dark Fountain next, Susie must not get a guitar, need soul, without soul Kris will, Susie guitar code stop, police sacrifice next week, church tonight, Kris dark world no soul can't. And then the dialogue is cut short. Now, there are a few things worth mentioning, one being the changing of the dialogue's color, implying that there may be more than one person speaking on the phone here, though that isn't entirely confirmed. However, it also seems that whoever the person or people on the phone call may be are correlated to the strange shenanigans being pulled inside the Dark Worlds, as the white dialogue specifically mentions the Dark Worlds by name. And there are other things worth noting, but first let's start trying to figure out who the person or people on the phone are. Now, there's a specific scene later in the Noelle house segment that gives us some slight clues as to who may be on the phone, as the same exact type of dialogue box appears here. This scene, which takes place in December Holiday's room, has some strange dialogue in which the person on the phone talks about Susie and the guitar. A look into the game's code reveals that this specific conversation is linked to a line of code called GML object obj home alone des phone create 0, which could give us some slight answers as to who this person is on the phone. Since the name of the code calls this des_phone, it is possible that this is saying that Des is the one calling in the scene after Susie gets the guitar, and considering how the dialogue box is the same as the kitchen, we could say that this is December on the phone, or if there are multiple people, we could say that December is at least one of the people on the phone here. However, there is a slight issue. Although it is highly likely that the name of the code could be referencing the person who is talking on the phone, it could also be referencing the place that Kris is when this call is happening. That being December's room. The major piece of evidence supporting this fact is that the other phone call, that being the one in the kitchen, is labeled as the kitchen phone call, instead of it being named after the someone or someones calling here. So despite it being possible for the caller to be the same as the name in the code here, it is more likely that this naming convention is referring to the place in which these calls are occurring and not actually the caller. But let's not rule out December as this caller quite yet, as there is some evidence that points towards it being someone we haven't met yet. In each of these calls, there's a very specific dialogue box and sound accompanied with the person speaking here, and though it could be ruled off as the phone speaker not sounding the same as when the person actually talks, there's some evidence saying that isn't the case, that being the phone call at the end of the weird route. At the end of Deltarune's alternative route, you will witness this scene of a failed phone call, one which goes to voicemail since Kris didn't pick up the phone. However, on the other end of the phone is Carol, Noelle's mom, which is confirmed in the code for this game object. This adds an extra air of mystery to the entire thing, as if the voice on the other end of the line is obscured here and not here, then either the person talking to us is using a voice changer of some kind, or alternatively it is someone who we haven't had dialogue from in the game so far. Considering how there are only two main people that we haven't had any direct dialogue from in the game so far, that being December and Asriel, we can guess that either it was one of those two, or it was someone we have already met using a voice changer. Though we'll go over why I don't think that's the case in a minute, but first let's go over one crucial thing for this theory. In order to find out who would actually be calling Kris here, we first have to find out who would actually have the capabilities to call Kris, and who would have the motive to do that. We know that anyone in the Dreamer family, that being Azrael, Toriel, and Asgore, would all have the ability to call Kris, and considering Kris is close friends with almost everyone in the Holiday family, it would make sense that they would all have Kris's number as well. It is pretty unlikely that most of the other people in Hometown would know Kris's number, and we can rule out almost all Darkners, as the only ones that we see with phones or something similar are Spamton and Tenna, although I find it unlikely that they would be calling since the phones in the Dark World that we've seen don't work very well. The last two people I could imagine having Kris's number would be Birdly and Susie, as Birdly seems to be acquainted with Kris at the very least, and Susie over the course of Deltarune has made friends with Kris. However, there is another option that, although isn't worth a lot of consideration, might be worth putting on this list, that being the Mystery Man. However, unless it's stated explicitly to be the Eggman, I'm going to assume he wasn't the caller here. With the list of people who would have called complete, it is time to talk about who actually has a motive to call Kris here, along with who would actually have the opportunity and knowledge that the caller has. Toriel is one of our least likely candidates here, as she is not likely to know about the Dark Worlds or Tessa's guitar, and although she does know about human souls slightly more than most other characters, since she checked out the book from the library about humans, she is most likely not the one calling here. Another two characters that we can cross off the list are Noelle and Susie, as they were just in the other room, and it seems unlikely that one of them would be able to call without the other noticing. Not to mention Noelle lost her phone, and Susie doesn't have one of her own, as shown at the end of chapter 2 when Toriel offers to let her call her family. Birdly is unlikely not only because he isn't the most knowledgeable about Dark Worlds and human souls, but also because he doesn't get along with Kris very well. Spamton and Tenna are out of the equation since both of them could be in their Light World form during this, not to mention the phones not working very well in the Dark World. Asgore would be a likely candidate for this, if not for him being in the house at the exact same time as this interaction is going on. On the same note, Rudy is not a terrible choice here, however, he also isn't the most likely candidate considering his bedridden condition. That leaves us with three real candidates for who could have been on this call, that being December Holiday, Carol Holiday, and Azrael Dreamer, along with the Mystery Man, though that one seems unlikely. And of these three, there's only one that seems particularly likely, along with one that is potentially a massive red herring and one that is unknown. December Holiday seems to be the Deltarune community's favorite Deus Ex Machina recently, being the answer to almost all theories as of right now. However, I think there's a decent amount of evidence pointing us towards the conclusion that Des is the one calling here. Not only does one of the calls happen specifically in Des's room, but of these types of calls that happen in chapter 4, 2 out of 3 occur when inside of the Holiday Manor, the other occurring in Kris's bedroom at the end of the normal playthrough, along with the dialogue being distinctly unique compared to the other phone call dialogue received, even from Carol, one of the other possible candidates for the caller here. Not only that, but the sound that plays whenever the person talks through the phone is heavily distorted, similar to how the phones in the Dark World give off nothing but garbage noise, which if the caller were in the Dark World, then this would make a lot more sense. Carol is a strange character, not only being seen only once throughout the entirety of Deltarune, but also being the mayor of Hometown and the mother of the disappearing December Holiday, and there is quite a bit of evidence to support her possibly being the caller on the phone. The main piece of evidence for Carol being the caller is this line of dialogue which says, "I'll be right there," after Susie gets the guitar, after which is the appearance of Carol at the Holiday household. This, along with the fact that she immediately goes after the guitar that Susie is holding, seems to point towards her being a very likely candidate for the caller, the one that we are supposed to expect. However, there is also some evidence that points to her being a possible red herring. To start, the strange broken sentences that the caller speaks in don't match Carol's dialogue when we see her at the house, along with not matching the phone call that she sends at the end of the Weird Route. This doesn't exclude her from being the caller, however it does seem less likely because of those facts. Despite that, I think it's pretty likely that she could actually be the caller here. However, there is one last person that we haven't talked about yet, that being Azrael Dreamer. Azrael, Kris's sibling, is a huge mystery, supposedly being off at college despite several hints that point in a different direction. However, given that we don't know much about Azrael and Deltarune, it is entirely possible that he could be the mystery caller that we hear during these scenes. Sure, out of the 3 real candidates that we have, it would make the least sense, considering the line I'll be right there, with no Azrael to be seen anywhere nearby. However, there is an argument to be made for Azrael being the mystery person on the phone. We know that Azrael is supposed to be home from college sometime soon, so if this line of dialogue is referring to when Azrael will be home the next day, then it could be possible for Azrael to be the caller. Now, the 3 major candidates for who could have been on the phone are great, but which one of them was actually on the phone? Well, given all the evidence, it's clear that we were supposed to think it was Carol. However, it seems likely that this is a red herring, while the true caller is December Holiday. With the large air of mystery surrounding the entire thing, it's impossible to be sure until we get a confirmation later in Deltarune. However, I would love to hear what you all have to say in the comments, whether you think it's one of these 3 or someone else. And with that, we have covered all the currently available information about who was actually calling Kris's phone, along with talking about who is the most likely candidate. However, there is still plenty more Deltarune information that has yet to be talked about. Though several theories are being created each day, there is so much information in Deltarune that hasn't been analyzed and studied yet. But with each release of a new chapter, we get a slightly clearer vision of what is actually happening in this world. Also, considering this is the 3rd theory I've made since Deltarune released, if you watch this video all the way to the end, then consider yourself a semi-OG. I greatly appreciate the support you all have given these theory videos, as it allows me to continue creating videos just like this one. And speaking of supporting the channel, I would like to thank Epoch's channel members for all they do in helping this channel and for helping this channel lift off the ground in the first place. With all that being said, this has been Epoch, your favorite place for everything indie game related, and I hope I'll see you all in the next one.